In the winter of 1944, as Europe froze under iron skies, American tank crews faced a nightmare born of steel and precision. The German Panther, sleek, angular, and deadly, had rewritten the rules of armored warfare. Its gun could pierce a Sherman's armor from over a mile away. Its own sloped armor, 4 inches thick across the front, shrugged off the American 75mm like pebbles against a fortress wall. For men inside the Sherman, it was not a fair fight. The M4 was dependable, mass-produced, and adaptable, but on paper, hopelessly outclassed. Tank crews learned early that to survive, they couldn't rely on numbers or doctrine alone. They would have to bend the rules, and sometimes break them. By the end of 1944, across the ruined villages of France and the forests of Belgium, an unspoken idea had begun to spread through the American armored ranks. A small, almost invisible modification, a trick with the elevation system of the Sherman's main gun, allowed its gunners to achieve what the manuals said was impossible. With a few extra degrees of elevation, the humble 75mm gun could strike at angles and ranges that transformed the underdog tank into a weapon capable of killing Panthers. This technique was never sanctioned. It wasn't found in field manuals, nor demonstrated in training films. It spread from crew to crew through whispered explanations in motor pools, quick sketches in notebooks, and the casual wisdom exchanged between survivors. Nobody could say exactly who discovered it first. But by the war's final months, it had reached tank units from the 2nd Armored Division in the north to the 6th Armored, pushing toward the Rhine. The spread of this knowledge followed invisible lines. The rotation of wounded men through field hospitals. The transfer of experienced crews between depleted units. The late-night conversations in bivouacs, where exhausted tankers shared what had kept them alive. It wasn't organized or coordinated. It was organic, carried by word of mouth in a language that only those who'd faced a Panther could truly understand. By early 1945, variations of the technique had appeared in units that had never communicated directly, each one adapting the core idea to their own circumstances, their own tanks, their own desperation. This wasn't innovation for its own sake. It was survival distilled into motion, the accumulated wisdom of men who understood that the margin between life and death could be measured in degrees of arc and fractions of seconds. The mathematics of fear. The Panther's dominance was a mathematical fact. Introduced in 1943 after the Germans learned hard lessons against Soviet T-34s, the Panther was both heavily armored and sharply angled. Its frontal plate, sloped at 55 degrees, was the bane of Allied tankers. The 75mm KWK 42L-70 gun it carried was a masterpiece of ballistic engineering, a weapon capable of destroying a Sherman before American crews even spotted it. The numbers told a brutal story. At 2,000 yards, the Panther's gun could penetrate over 4 inches of vertical armor. The Sherman's frontal hull measured just 2 inches at its thickest point. Meanwhile, the Sherman's own 75mm M3 gun, firing standard armor-piercing ammunition, could barely scratch a Panther's glasses at any combat distance. Even at 300 yards, practically point-blank range by tank warfare standards, penetration was uncertain. The Sherman needed side or rear shots. The Panther could kill from any angle, at almost any range. The Sherman, by contrast, was the embodiment of American pragmatism. Reliable, simple, and built in the tens of thousands, it was a tank designed to be good enough, not invincible. Its 75mm M3 gun had been sufficient in North Africa against Panzer IIIs and IVs. But against Panthers and Tigers, it was nearly useless frontally. A Panther could hit from 2,000 yards. The Sherman needed to close to under 300. German optics compounded the problem. Zeiss precision gave Panther gunners clarity and magnification that turned engagements into sniper duels. Ones the Americans almost always lost. A Panther commander could identify a Sherman as a target before American crews even knew they were being hunted. The first indication of contact was often the screaming impact of an 88mm penetrator tearing through hull armor, followed by the flash of igniting ammunition and the smell of burning flesh. To close that distance meant gambling your life. Tankers knew the odds. They'd seen what happened when Shermans went head-to-head with Panthers in open country. Blackened wrecks, smoking craters, no survivors. Entire platoons were sometimes lost without scoring a single kill. The psychological weight of this imbalance was as heavy as the armor itself. Every road became a potential killing ground. Every tree line might conceal a Panther. Crews developed a kind of tactical paranoia that was entirely rational. The understanding that visibility worked in one direction only, and that direction favored the enemy. Some men cracked under the pressure. Others painted names and symbols on their tanks. Small acts of defiance against the statistics that said they probably wouldn't survive the month. Veterans described a sound that haunted them long after the war ended. The distinctive crack of a Panther's main gun, followed by the metallic scream of steel tearing through steel. Once heard, that sound changed you. It rewired your brain to treat every moment of silence as temporary, every successful engagement as borrowed time. Tank crews in the winter of 1944 understood viscerally what the reports only quantified. That they were outmatched, outgunned, and that survival depended less on training than on luck and innovation. This reality bred both fear and ingenuity. The crews who lived longest were not always the best marksmen, but the ones who learned to adapt. Doctrine said to attack in groups, to flank, to rely on maneuver and numbers. The 5-to-1 principle, 5 Shermans for every Panther, became unofficial policy. American commanders accepted those ratios because they had no alternative. But doctrine didn't account for the chaos of combat. For when a Panther appeared on high ground, commanding an open field, or when cover was too thin to allow a flank, in those moments, survival depended on more than courage. It depended on innovation. The forbidden adjustment. Among the men who embodied that spirit was Staff Sergeant Clarence Smoyer, a gunner with the 3rd Armored Division. Smoyer's crew, like many others, faced Panthers under brutal conditions during the push into Germany. Somewhere between necessity and intuition, they discovered that by overriding the Sherman's built-in elevation stops, mechanical limits designed to prevent damage, the gun could be raised a few critical degrees beyond what the engineers had allowed. The Sherman's elevation system was simple, but carefully controlled. Hydraulic assist coupled with a manual handwheel limited the gun's arc to roughly 5 degrees of depression and 25 degrees of elevation. These limits existed to protect the mechanism, to prevent recoil from damaging the turret roof, and to maintain balance during firing. The engineers who designed these systems had calculated precise stress tolerances, built-in safety margins, and established parameters that assumed normal operational use. Exceeding them meant risking the gun itself, and potentially the crew inside. But with careful pressure on the counterbalance and the elevation handwheel, a skilled gunner could push past those limits. It wasn't easy. The mechanism fought back, stiffening as it reached its mechanical stops. Metal groaned. Springs compressed to their limits. The trick was to feel that resistance, then push, just enough to cross the threshold without snapping something vital. Too little pressure accomplished nothing. Too much could strip gears, crack housings, or bend the elevation shaft itself. Done correctly, the gun lifted higher than its design allowed. The technique demanded a gunner's touch refined through hours of practice. New men attempting it often failed, either unable to generate sufficient force or forcing so hard they damaged the mechanism outright. Experienced gunners developed an almost supernatural sense for the resistance curve. That precise moment when the mechanical stops could be overridden without catastrophic failure. They compared it to other delicate mechanical tasks. Feeling the clutch engage in a transmission, sensing when a bolt was about to strip, understanding through fingertips and muscle memory what instruments and gauges could never convey. The loader had a role too. When the gun elevated beyond design limits, the recoil path changed. A 75mm gun firing at maximum over-elevation produced violent backward motion that could damage internal components or injure crew members. Loaders learned to brace themselves and the ammunition, positioning their bodies to absorb shock and prevent shells from shifting in their racks. It was coordination developed through repetition, an unspoken choreography performed inside a space barely large enough for 5 men. Tank commanders who understood what their gunners were attempting had to make instant calculations about acceptable risk. A jammed elevation mechanism in the middle of combat meant a dead tank, immobile, unable to return fire, waiting for the killing shot. But so did facing a Panther with standard elevation limits. The choice wasn't between risk and safety. It was between two different kinds of risk, and commanders learned to trust their crew's judgment about which gamble offered better odds. That additional elevation gave the Sherman new life. It allowed gunners to lob shells along higher arcs, reaching further and hitting from steeper angles, especially on the uneven terrain of Europe. Against a Panther, this meant aiming for its vulnerabilities: the thinner top armor above the turret, or the engine deck where steel was far less protective. The Panther's rear deck armor measured only 40mm, barely a quarter of the frontal protection. A high-angle shot that struck there could penetrate, ignite fuel, or disable the engine. Even a near miss could damage the cooling system or ignite external fuel tanks, leaving the Panther stranded and vulnerable. The additional range mattered too. At maximum elevation, the ballistic arc extended effective engagement distance by 300 to 500 yards, sometimes more depending on terrain. That might not sound like much, but in tank combat, an extra 300 yards meant the difference between being able to shoot back and dying without firing a shot. It meant Sherman crews could engage from positions that Panthers considered safe. It meant psychological relief, the knowledge that you weren't entirely helpless. Crews who used this method described it as both terrifying and liberating. It was dangerous. A single misjudgment could jam the elevation gear or break the recoil guard, leaving the gun useless in battle. But when it worked, it gave them a weapon that could finally reach the enemy, who had been untouchable for so long. The technique wasn't universal or standardized. Each crew developed their own variations based on their specific tank's quirks, their gunner's strength and skill, even the wear patterns on individual elevation mechanisms. Some manipulated only the hand wheel. Others applied pressure directly to the gun tube itself, using the counterbalance spring as a fulcrum. A few mechanically inclined crews made small physical modifications, filing down stop brackets, adding shims to change the geometry, or loosening specific bolts to allow greater travel. None of it appeared in maintenance logs. All of it violated regulations. Blood and ingenuity. During the Battle of the Bulge, when American armor was thrown into desperate winter fighting across the Ardennes, the elevation trick began to show its worth. In villages like Stoumont and La Glaise, where Panthers from the 1st SS Panzer Division clashed with American units, Sherman crews used every scrap of advantage they could find. One report described a Sherman firing over a burning half-track, using the extra elevation to drop shells onto the rear of a Panther sitting behind rubble. The first shot bounced, the second struck the engine deck. Flames followed. The gun had to be repaired afterward, but the crew walked away alive. The close-quarters nature of the Bulge fighting created situations where the elevation trick proved decisive. In the narrow streets of Belgian towns, Panthers couldn't leverage their range advantage. But they still had armor that made them nearly invincible frontally. American crews found themselves forced into near-suicidal charges, closing to ranges measured in tens of yards, not hundreds, just to find firing angles that might penetrate. The elevation override gave them one more option. By firing from behind cover or through windows at extreme angles, gunners could drop rounds onto thinner top surfaces or strike vulnerable points that standard elevation made unreachable. The fighting in the Ardennes also revealed another advantage: the ability to engage targets on higher ground. Panthers positioned on ridges or hillsides dominated the valleys below, turning roads into death traps. Standard Sherman elevation couldn't reach these positions effectively. The angle was too steep, the distance too great. Crews using the override technique could engage these positions, forcing Panthers to relocate or risk destruction. It didn't eliminate the Panthers' advantages, but it narrowed them. It gave American armor a fighting chance where none had existed before. Urban combat brought even more opportunities. In Cologne, March 1945, Smoyer himself achieved one of the most famous tank kills of the war. A Panther destroyed in a street duel captured on film. The footage doesn't reveal every detail of his firing solution, but Smoyer later described using every bit of elevation and depression available to find his shot through debris and rubble. Whether he used the full override or not, the technique he helped pioneer had already spread throughout the armored corps. The Cologne engagement became iconic, partly because it was filmed, but also because it symbolized what American tank crews had learned through bitter experience. The Sherman in that footage, Pershing, named by Smoyer's crew, rolled through rubble-choked streets with deliberate caution, the crew knowing that around any corner might wait a Panther or Tiger. When the German tank appeared, the engagement lasted seconds. Smoyer's shot struck the Panther's turret, penetrating and detonating ammunition. The German tank erupted in flames. The newsreel footage shows it all in grainy black and white. Proof that American armor could win these duels, but never context for the hundreds of small decisions and adaptations that made that single shot possible. By then, hundreds of gunners across Europe were using similar improvisations. Some manipulated the elevation. Others adjusted the gunner's periscope mount or modified recoil guards to gain more arc. A few even placed shims under the elevation stop brackets, small metal pieces that physically altered the limits of the gun's travel. None of it was authorized. All of it worked. The Hürtgen forest battles, fought through autumn 1944 in some of the worst terrain imaginable, had already demonstrated the value of these adaptations. The dense woodland created a claustrophobic nightmare where visibility rarely exceeded 50 yards. Panthers positioned on the limited clear areas, roads, fire breaks, stream beds, could engage anything that moved. The forest restricted American numerical advantages, while giving German armor prepared positions with excellent fields of fire. Sherman crews died in horrifying numbers trying to navigate this green hell. But the same terrain that favored defense also created opportunities for unconventional tactics. The steep slopes and broken ground meant that standard elevation limits often prevented effective fire. Crews learned to use the override to engage Panthers that had hull-down positions on hillsides or to fire over fallen trees and crater lips that blocked normal sight lines. Unit after-action reports from the Hurtgen frequently mention gunners maximizing elevation or achieving non-standard firing solutions, careful phrasing that acknowledged the techniques without officially condoning them. Commanders who learned of these modifications faced a dilemma. On one hand, they couldn't officially condone a technique that might destroy valuable equipment. Maintenance capacity was stretched thin. Every tank mattered. Ordnance officers worried about cascading failures, about elevation mechanisms breaking at critical moments and leaving units under strength. On the other hand, they couldn't ignore results. Reports filtering through the ranks told of Panthers destroyed in situations where, by all logic, Shermans should have been helpless. In many cases, the gunners credited their survival to the trick. Most commanders resolved this tension through willful ignorance. They didn't ask detailed questions about how their crews were achieving certain kills. They didn't inspect elevation mechanisms too closely. When maintenance reports noted unusual wear patterns or damaged components, they approved the repairs without investigating root causes. This unofficial policy of "don't ask, don't tell" allowed the technique to spread while maintaining plausible deniability for officers who might otherwise face discipline for allowing unauthorized modifications. In the forests of the Hurtgen and the hills of Lorraine, these improvisations became a kind of underground doctrine. Young men, many barely 20, began to think like engineers. They developed an instinctive understanding of the machines they fought in, learning how far they could push before something broke. What began as a desperate gamble became a practiced skill, refined through repetition and shared among crews like a secret handshake. For some, it changed everything. A few extra degrees of elevation might mean striking first in a duel where fractions of a second determined life or death. It could turn a hopeless shot into a kill. The added range, sometimes extending effective engagement distance by several hundred yards, also gave American crews psychological relief. They no longer felt entirely outgunned. For once, they could fight on something closer to equal terms. The legacy of broken rules. By early 1945, this collective ingenuity was quietly reshaping battlefield outcomes. American armor, once considered inferior, began holding its own against German tanks more consistently. Part of that improvement came from better ammunition. The arrival of HVAP, high-velocity armor piercing, rounds with tungsten cores capable of piercing Panther armor under the right conditions. But the rest came from experience, adaptation, and human will. The forbidden elevation trick fit perfectly into that pattern. A small change with outsized results. VAP ammunition, when combined with the elevation technique, proved particularly effective. The tungsten core rounds maintained their velocity and penetrating power at longer ranges than standard ammunition. This meant that the additional distance gained through maximum elevation translated directly into lethal capability. Sherman crews fortunate enough to receive HVAP, it remained scarce throughout the war, found they could engage Panthers at ranges approaching 800 or 900 yards, with reasonable chance of penetration. This still didn't match the Panthers' reach, but it narrowed the gap from suicidal to merely dangerous. The synergy between better ammunition and better technique illustrated a larger truth about American armored warfare. No single solution existed for the Sherman's disadvantages. Victory came through accumulation, better tactics, plus better ammunition, plus better crew training, plus field innovations like the elevation trick. Each element alone was insufficient. Together, They transformed the Sherman from outmatched to competitive. When war ended, the Army studied these field innovations with interest. Ordnance officers interviewed tank crews returning from Europe, collecting hundreds of pages of reports about non-standard techniques. The findings were clear. Units that encouraged mechanical experimentation and tactical adaptation performed better and suffered fewer losses. Even the tanks themselves reflected the lessons learned. The late-war M4A3E8 EZ-8, with its improved suspension and higher velocity 76mm gun, featured stronger elevation and traverse mechanisms that could tolerate greater stress. Later, American tanks like the M26 Pershing and M46 Patton built upon those design lessons directly. The post-war analysis went deeper than simple mechanical improvements. Army Ground Forces researchers identified a pattern. Crews that developed their own solutions to tactical problems showed better morale, lower rates of combat fatigue, and higher survival rates than crews that rigidly followed doctrine. The ability to problem-solve under pressure, to feel agency in desperate circumstances, proved as important to combat effectiveness as armor thickness or gun caliber. This finding influenced how the Army approached training and doctrine for decades afterward. The M48 and M60 tanks that served through the Cold War incorporated extended elevation ranges as standard features, directly informed by reports of World War II field modifications. Engineers designed these systems with the understanding that combat conditions would push every mechanism to its limits and beyond. They built in tolerances that earlier designers would have considered excessive. They assumed that crews would improvise, and designed for that reality rather than against it. But for the men who'd used those tricks in combat, the legacy was more personal. The forbidden elevation wasn't about engineering. It was about survival. It gave gunners a sense of agency in a fight where the odds were brutally one-sided. Many who served in Shermans spoke afterward of the helplessness they'd felt facing a Panther head-on. That helplessness vanished the moment they realized they could bend the machine to their will, even if it meant breaking the rules. It also changed how the Army thought about innovation itself. Before World War II, military doctrine was rigid. Orders flowed downward, and initiative was often punished. But after the war, the U.S. military began to see flexibility and adaptability as core virtues, not liabilities. The very idea that a sergeant in a tank turret could invent a better way to fight became a cornerstone of American doctrine for decades to come. This cultural shift proved as important as any tactical innovation. The modern American military's emphasis on decentralized decision-making, on empowering junior leaders to adapt and improvise, traces directly back to lessons learned in the turrets of Shermans during World War II. The elevation trick and techniques like it demonstrated that innovation didn't require committees or formal research programs. Sometimes, it just required desperate men with mechanical aptitude and the courage to try something new. Echoes in steel. In interviews years later, Clarence Smoyer spoke about those days without bravado. He didn't describe himself as a hero or an inventor, just a man trying to stay alive. When asked about techniques like the elevation trick, he said it seemed natural at the time. "We did what we had to do," he told one historian. "If the manual said one thing and the battlefield said another, you listened to the battlefield." That quiet defiance, that willingness to trust human instinct over mechanical limitation, defined not just Smoyer's crew, but an entire generation of tankers. They took machines built in factories thousands of miles away and reshaped them through use, experience, and desperation. They found new ways to make those machines fight above their weight. Smoyer's humility was typical of his generation. When pressed for details about specific engagements, he demurred, insisting that every crew faced similar challenges and that luck played as large a role as skill. But the men who served alongside him told a different story. They described a gunner who could feel the precise moment when the elevation mechanism reached its limit and knew exactly how much additional force to apply. They recalled engagements where Smoyer achieved kills that seemed impossible, shots that required perfect understanding of ballistics, mechanics, and timing. His modesty reflected a generation that preferred to deflect attention rather than claim credit. The Panther remains one of the most formidable tanks of the war, a marvel of engineering, beautifully designed for its purpose. But in the end, it lost to men who refused to accept inferiority. The Sherman, often derided as mediocre, won because its crews were willing to take risks and push limits that no engineer could calculate. German tank design philosophy emphasized technical superiority, building individual vehicles that dominated any opponent in single combat. American philosophy emphasized reliability, ease of production, and adaptability. The Panther was a better tank than the Sherman by almost every measurable standard. But wars aren't won by individual duels. They're won by logistics, by combined arms coordination, by air superiority, and by the accumulated wisdom of thousands of small innovations developed by men who understood that survival trumped specifications. That's the true legacy of the forbidden elevation trick. It wasn't a mechanical adjustment. It was a mindset, one that turned fear into creativity and turned an ordinary tank into something extraordinary. When historians look back at the closing months of World War II, they often cite overwhelming Allied production or air superiority as the reasons for victory. But on the ground, inside those cramped steel coffins, it came down to individuals like Smoyer and the countless unnamed gunners who learned how to make their weapons do more than they were ever meant to. The statistical records tell part of the story. By March 1945, Sherman loss rates had declined significantly compared to the previous autumn. Some of this resulted from German collapse, fewer Panthers operational, less fuel, worse crew training. But after-action reports also show American crews achieving better kill ratios, surviving engagements that earlier would have been catastrophic. The elevation technique and others like it contributed to this improvement in ways that raw numbers can't fully capture. In that frozen winter of 1944, the Sherman was never meant to kill a Panther. Yet, through the stubborn ingenuity of the men inside, it did, again and again. A few degrees of elevation, a small act of rebellion, a choice made in the space between life and death. That's how innovation is born, not in laboratories or headquarters, but in the minds of ordinary men facing impossible odds. The lesson resonates beyond World War II, beyond armored warfare, into every arena where humans confront technological disadvantage or systemic limitation. Sometimes the answer isn't building something new. Sometimes it's understanding what you already have deeply enough to push it beyond what anyone thought possible. The Sherman crews of 1945 couldn't wait for better tanks or better ammunition. They made what they had work through knowledge and courage and the willingness to break rules when rules meant death. And because of them, the tank that was never supposed to win did. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.